Thank you everybody to join our session today. The session is on Astrobiology and Planetary Sciences by Dr. Siddharth Pandey sir. He is head of Center of Excellence in Astrobiology at Amity University, Mumbai. And also he was a visiting researcher in NASA, a TEDx speaker, a scientist from BMSIC, Blue Marble Space Institute. And he has a good experience in his field, starting from let it be aerospace engineering to astrobiology. So let's welcome him. Let's give him a warm welcome, and we shall start the webinar now. So once sir shares the screen, we will begin it. And when for asking any queries and concerns, whenever sir will ask you in between that you can ask your questions now, just type your questions in the chat box, and we will pick the questions for you so that sir can answer. Also, there would be a good discussion session at the end of the webinar. So don't worry about whether your queries will be taken or not. Just have patience and welcome to the webinar once again. And it's a request that not to enable your audio and visual feed anytime during the webinar. Also, even by mistake, do not click on present now as Siddharth sir is presenting. So your screen shouldn't be there.
All right. Thanks, Shivam. I have shared my screen. Are you able to see my screen, Shivam?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can see your screen, sir.
Okay. So I will begin.
Okay,
are you
sir.
all
So
also able to see my screen as well, my video feed, camera feed, while I'm talking through this?
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
We can see your face also. So I will disable my audio feed.
Okay, sounds good. So welcome everyone. Very good afternoon. I hope all of you are healthy and safe wherever everybody is. And I would really like to thank Spaceonova for this opportunity to speak, with all of you students as well as other interested folks in space. And I will take hopefully not longer than 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and give you a little bit of an introduction about myself, my background, how did I get into space, and what has been my journey. And then I will talk about some very interesting, but at the same time, complex topics. So I will try to simplify them and give a overview of some of these topics. And hopefully by the end of it, I would have convinced some of you on the excitement that one gets when you work in a field of astrobiology and planetary sciences. So my name is Siddharth. I currently am heading a new center of excellence in astrobiology at Amity University in Mumbai. Alongside that, I'm also holding two positions, one with Blue Marble Space Institute of Science in the US as a research scientist, and it's a science communication centric organization that works with organizations such as Spaceonova in passing on the passion, excitement, information, and awareness about topics such as space. And the other organization that I'm part of is the Mars Society of Australia, which is the Australian Society of the Mars Society, which started off in the US. And through this society, we work on spreading awareness about the importance of the exploration of the planet Mars and what potential it has to solving not just some scientific questions about Mars, but also potentially some problems that we face here on Earth can be solved by studying another planet. So these are the two organizations that I'm part of. Now, first off, what is astrobiology? Astrobiology is the study of the origins, evolution, and search for life. This is a compressed definition of a very large field of research, which is highly disciplinary. And I will get to it. I thought I'll first, I'm assuming that most of you are students and many of you must be from different backgrounds. I would like to give you a perspective of my journey and how did I get into the field of astrobiology. So it's obviously all started here in India. I did my undergraduate in aerospace engineering, BTech in aerospace engineering, and I actually graduated from the organization that I'm working for. So I did my BTech in aerospace engineering from Amity University in Noida, and I graduated in 2010. And right after that, I went to IIT Bombay for a year as a research fellow. And I was working on combustion, so looking at how fuels burn. And we were working on some concepts where we were trying to build detonation engines, so using controlled explosions to propagate a plane or any form of craft. So my work was on understanding how this fluid physics takes place. And after 1 year at IIT Bombay, I moved to the Netherlands. I took up a Master's of Science in Aerospace Engineering. And while I was there at the Netherlands, I got an opportunity to do a summer internship at NASA Ames. So right after that, actually right in the middle of my Master's, after completing 1 year, I moved to California. And I was initially there as a summer intern, and we worked on designing and developing some experiments that were launched to the International Space Station. We did some biological experiments, and I was, from an engineering background, involved in the design and development of the hardware, the modules. So I actually got an opportunity to build something that actually flew to space. And that's a very empowering feeling when you work on something and in the end you see that that particular product of yours is actually going to space. And that summer internship rolled into a longer position. So all in all, I was there for about 2 years at NASA Ames, and I was involved in two groups. One of them was this project that I mentioned, where we were building experiments that were conducted on the International Space Station. For those of you who are not familiar with the International Space Station, it's a orbiting platform. It's a large platform, about the size of, you can say, 3 football fields. So it's very large, and it's been assembled in the 90s. It was assembled by NASA in collaboration with some other organizations, such as the European Space Agency, the Russians, the Japanese, and the Canadians. And it's constantly crewed by at least 3 astronauts. At times, I think 1, but most of the times there are 3 astronauts on board. So they do a lot of scientific experiments on the space station, and our experiments were flown on it. And I was also part of astrobiology projects. So that was my first initiation into astrobiology when I was there at NASA Ames. And that is actually one of the few centers in the world where astrobiology started. It was one of the foremost centers where the scientists were talking about the concept of whether we can find life in the universe. And some of the initial Mars missions that were launched by NASA were actually designed at NASA Ames. So I was part of a group of planetary scientists who were involved in building Mars landers and rovers that actually collect samples from the surface of Mars. So that was my second project at NASA Ames, alongside this International Space Station project, where I was working on developing concepts for sample collection from the surface of Mars. And while I was there, I was really, I think I'd found my true calling, and I felt that this is exactly what I want to do in my life. I wanted to work on concepts that involved collecting samples and bringing them to scientists for analysis. I thought that as an engineer, that was my true calling. As a service to humanity, I wanted to work on projects that helped us answer some of these very important questions, in my opinion, which is whether there is life out there or not. And if there is life, is it similar to Earth life, or is it different? And you can be an engineer and still work on these teams. And that is one thing I didn't realize. I thought that if you have to work on a field like astrobiology, you have to be a scientist. But even as an engineer, you can get yourself, more research experience. And for that, I took out an opportunity to travel to Australia. So my journey around the world continued, and I was selected on a full scholarship to go to the University of New South Wales in Australia to get a PhD in aerospace engineering. and the topic was doing some thermal design work. So we were basically designing systems that would ensure that, because as many of you would know, Mars is a very cold planet. So my work was on ensuring that the rover did not freeze in the sub-zero temperatures. And there are some components like cameras, batteries that are very sensitive to temperature. So don't ever try keeping your phone in the freezer, because many of the components are not designed to operate at very low temperatures. So same problems are faced by some of these electronic components on rovers that go to Mars. So as engineers, we try to solve these problems, and I was focused on doing some analysis using simulations in computers as well as experiments, actual experiments where we actually built a Mars chamber within which we were able to simulate the temperature and pressure that you find on Mars. Only gravity we could not simulate, obviously, because the gravity on Mars is 1/3 of what we have here on Earth. But nonetheless, I think it was an interesting 4 years where I was able to work closely and develop some concepts for astrobiology missions where we were trying to do these Mars rover designs. And from there, my journey came back home. So I was, in fact, involved in a couple of astrobiology projects where we were studying some very Mars-like regions here in India. And Ladakh happens to be one of them. I'll talk about it in detail as we go on. And I was working closely with my university where I did my undergraduate, which is Amity University. And they were very forthcoming and very cooperative when it came to establishing some research that would support space exploration. So I was very fortunate to be part of an education group like Amity, where they actually saw space as a future, as one of the fields that would be important for humanity, and not just from a scientific point of view, but also to incite passion and curiosity amongst students. So as a field, it would really ensure that people are really passionate about the subject. Now, just to give you a little more idea of what I did, I was mainly a aerospace engineer who was involved in biological experiments and astrobiology experiments. And my background was on modeling of multi-phase flows, so flows that would be a mixture of solid and gas, and experimental design and assembly. So I've listed all my institutions as well as some of the projects that I did. And the reason I've done this is I'm sure a lot of students would be curious to understand the path from aerospace engineering into planetary science and specifically astrobiology. So this video webinar, I'm sure, will be online, and others will also be able to refer to it. So I hope that this information is in the interest of many of you who are looking at ways in which you can transition. And you have to make your own paths. Like, you have to find your own true calling and keep working and training yourself in new subjects, new fields, and slowly you transition from one field to another. And it's very much possible. So don't feel at any point of time that, if you are only a mechanical student, you cannot learn software or you cannot work on something else. It's not easy, but as long as you have interest, you can keep developing your skill sets as you go along. So with this, I will start my presentation on astrobiology and planetary sciences. Now, many of you might have seen this image. Normally, if I was in a classroom, I would have asked you to raise your hands and say how many of you have seen this image. But because this is being done over webinar and I cannot hear or see all of you, because right now I'm sharing my screen, I'm hoping some of you have seen this image. But for the benefit of those who have not seen this image, this is an image which is captured by a spacecraft which was leaving the solar system. So Voyager 2 was a spacecraft that when it was leaving the solar system, it was designed to take a photograph of Earth. So if you see in your screen towards the right side, you will see one faint vertical beam of light, like a band that is coming. And in the middle of that, you will see a small dot, a pale blue dot. So this was the famous pale blue dot image, which Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer, I hope many of you have heard about him. If you have not, I think you should go to YouTube and hear some of his short, video cuts from Cosmos, which was a very popular space series that was initially run by him and became immensely popular and inspired many people. It was actually before even when I was watching television. It was way back in the early 80s. But right now, Neil deGrasse Tyson is also doing Cosmos 2, and it's available, I think, on Netflix. So you should watch it. But this pale blue dot image is basically an image of the Earth, and Carl Sagan describes it as one of the most, I think, underpinning moments of space exploration. That if you look at this image and if you see that small dot, you're made to realize that everything that we know of exists within that small pale blue dot. That all the kingdoms, the empires, the battles, all the personalities, everything that we know sits inside that. And it is made to make us realize the importance of how we are all just suspended on this small, very fragile planet that is being exposed with this beam of light from the sun that is coming and making it shine in front of us. So that is really, I think, the foundations or the philosophy of astrobiology, that a person who studies or works in the field of astrobiology is constantly aware of this particular phenomenon. He doesn't treat himself in any way superior to anybody else, nor does he feel that the work that is being done in the field of astrobiology is having no relevance to anything around him. So it's such a large field that it is almost impossible to say that it is not relevant, because it kind of encompasses everything. So like I said, astrobiology is the study of the origin and the distribution of life in the universe. So there are several aspects of astrobiology. So you have exobiology, which is normally a term that was initially coined and is now not used very much, but it basically pertains with the origin and the evolution and adaptation of life in different environments. And these are in green. I have listed some of the disciplines of sciences, so molecular biology, biochemistry, biophysics, astronomy, and astrophysics. So these pertain with some of the initial life, that when it started off, the simple life, how did it start at the molecular level? So that's what exobiology basically works with, the RNA world or the DNA world within which it existed. Another aspect is studying different planets, so habitable worlds. So habitability is basically a very widely discussed term in astrobiology. So when you're trying to study other planets and seeing what are the different conditions that are helping support life is basically what habitability is all about. So aside from our own planet, we have Mars, we have Venus and icy moons and planets outside our solar system, which basically are called exoplanets. So studying these environments and their terrains and their atmospheres and seeing whether they are having the potential to have supported life in the past or maybe presently supporting life is coming under the area of habitability. So studying habitable worlds. Another part is studying materials that are coming in through meteorites. So whenever you have, any form of a meteorite that is entering the Earth's atmosphere and depositing itself, it's giving you a chance to study material that is far away from Earth. So extraterrestrial materials. So these are, and some of them have actually been shown to have some organic compounds. So nobody has found any clear-cut, definition or a clear-cut proof that there is life that has been confirmed inside these rocks in the form of any microorganisms, but they have surely found organic compounds which are also found on Earth and eventually led to the formation of life. So some of these very important critical organic compounds such as amino acids have been found, and studying them is also an important area within astrobiology. And lastly, there is another concept of space biology, which is to see how does the life that we know of currently on Earth, that could be human life, it could be microbial life, it could be the life of plants, it could be the life of small animals like reptiles, insects, mammals. How do they behave, or how does their systems get affected when they are exposed to space environment? So that could be microgravity environment. As soon as you leave the surface of the Earth and you take these organisms outside of the Earth's protective atmosphere, when it is exposed to space radiation, when it is exposed to radiation from the universe, from the cosmic radiation or solar radiation, extreme temperature environments, when it is exposed to the reduced gravity environment. So how do they behave? How do they evolve over time as well to that kind of an environment? So that field is called space biology. Traditionally, this is not coined within astrobiology, but for the sake of interest, I've included it here as well. It is also very important for us to understand what is not astrobiology, as it's a field that is newly, you can say, established, especially in India, and outside as well. It's only been a few decades since when it was installed. So it is definitely not astrology. So astrology is a study of the movements and relative positions of celestial bodies, interpreted as having an influence on human affairs and the natural world. Well, it's not been scientifically established, so it does not classify as a science, but it is more so of a study that many people look at, and some of it more from an entertainment point of view, or just observational point of view, and many people use astrology to make life decisions. Well, everyone's, I think, open to their own personal judgments or decisions, but for astrobiologists, it's very clear to ensure that we inform people in the public that astrology is nothing to do with what we do. Our work is fact-based, it is logical, rational, and will change in the future if things are proven differently. And it will always have a logical approach in which we go ahead. And it is definitely not something that we are speculating about or anything. And everything is happening within a very strong peer-reviewed scientific community. So whenever a research paper comes out in astrobiology, it comes out that is being vetted by people within the science community, who are neutral and having no bias towards us. And that is what makes us very different from other pursuits like astrology. And it's also important to ensure that the people know that astrobiology is not just a branch of biology. It is much more than that. See, when you're trying to understand how life started, you have to have a clear understanding of the environment in which it started. So you have to have a full understanding of the geology, the rocks or the environment in which it is starting, the interaction between the air of the time and the rocks, the fluids, how did the energy basically support the kick-starting of different chemical reactions. So it requires a deep understanding of chemistry, geology, thermodynamics. And if you're looking at a planetary scale, if you're trying to find planets far away from Earth, it is requiring a huge amount of knowledge of astronomy, and also perhaps, given the fact that there are so many such planets, using techniques such as machine learning or artificial intelligence to try to break down some of that information that is coming in, as our telescopes are able to find all of these different planets. So it requires a huge amount of mathematics, software engineering alongside biology. So astrobiology is a large interdisciplinary field that requires a close amount of interaction between these fields. So I've just left some of these popular quotes about astrology, about astrobiology. I think that people would find very interesting. So I will now talk about our center here in Amity University, Mumbai. So this has just been established last year. So our center is called Amity Center of Excellence in Astrobiology, or AQUA, like we would like to term it. AQUA, similar to aqua meaning water, as a critical resource for life. And we have been established last year in February, and it's the first center that is specifically dedicated for astrobiology research. So right now we have many labs in the country that are doing some very relevant astrobiology work, but none of them have a singular focus on astrobiology, whereas we have a center of excellence that is specifically focused on astrobiology research and nothing else. So some of our focus areas are, we have in fact been involved in designing and building some experiments for ISRO. So we recently had an experiment selected. I'll talk a bit about that. That will be going up on the next ISRO PSLV. It will be the first plant experiment from India, designed in India and launching from Indian soil. The second thing that we have been involved in for the last few years, even before the center was established, is Mars analog field work. So we visit some areas on Earth that are very similar to Mars or early Mars, and some of them happen to be in India. And I have a few slides that talk about these analog environments. And the other thing that we have been involved in is student training and research mentoring as well. So I'll give a brief overview of what kind of projects that we have at Amity, as well as some of the other organizations that we are partnering with, such as Mars Society Australia, Open University in the UK, Blue Marble Space, and we also partnered with First Post Media for some of our communication outreach work. And we have an MOU with Paris Defense Technologies Limited. They are an aerospace defense manufacturing company, so we've worked with them on technology development. So maybe I think I will just ask at this point if there are any questions, if people are interested in asking. Maybe Shivam, if you can tell me if there's any questions so far.
Yeah, so everyone, you can now use the chat section to ask your questions, and I will pick up questions for you guys. So you can use the chat section to ask your questions now. One question is, how is astrophysics different from astrobiology? Well, it is self-evident, I think. Would you like to take up this
Sure.
question, sir?
So, I mean, again, astrophysics is again a very complex field that pertains with the physical nature of the universe. It's basically dealing with all forms of theoretical as well as experimental observational aspects of some of the celestial bodies that we see. How do they behave? Stars, black holes, gravity. And astrobiology, like I defined, is a field that is specifically looking at the questions of how life has evolved and how is it developing or evolving on our planet, and what are the prospects of finding it elsewhere. So those are the two different definitions of astrophysics and astrobiology.
So next question is, how we determine the atmosphere and minerals in exoplanets?
So that's a good question. So there are several techniques that are used to study and observe these planets. And one of the techniques, as an example, I can tell you is these are very far away from us. So they're not as close as Mars or some of the other planets in our own solar system. So it's pretty much a dot really that you're looking at, even with the strongest telescopes that we have on Earth, as well as telescopes that we have in space, like Hubble Space Telescope. So one of the techniques that is used is you have this particular planet that is orbiting around its star, and you can look at the star. So based on the speed at which it is orbiting, based on the size of the planet, you can tell many different things. You can tell about the mass of the planet. The speed at which it is rotating around the star also tells you a bit about how far away it is from the particular sun or from the particular star. So once you know the size of the planet, you know the mass of the planet, you know how far away it is. So based on our understanding of how do planets evolve based on our solar system, there are certain inferences that are made on, firstly, the age of the particular star also will tell you a bit about how old that particular planet is. And if you know some of the physical aspects of its density, its mass, its volume, how far away it is from the particular star, it can tell you a bit about, it can give you some initial inferences about its atmosphere. And if you're really keenly looking at it and you're able to look at its atmosphere as well, then based on the kind of energy wavelength that is coming back at you, you can actually break that down and find some very signature wavelengths that tell you a bit about its atmosphere.
Okay, sir. And there is one question in general which I'm observing. People are asking, suppose if they are from engineering or as from a background which is not related to biology, can they still pursue astrobiology as a career?
Absolutely, you can. Look at me. I don't have any background in biology, but I'm pursuing astrobiology. So like I mentioned, you definitely need to work on a relevant research topic. So in your own capacity, if you're not having a biology background, it definitely does not hurt for you to pick up certain fundamental aspects of, maybe prebiotic. So basically looking at some of the initial conditions in which life was formed. So you can do some courses by yourself and arm yourself with some of the information that you would need to work on certain concepts. It really depends on what kind of project within astrobiology you're working on. For example, if you want to work on developing a particular instrument that helps you find certain signatures of life. For example, looking for some specific elements or certain minerals. So if you are someone with an instrumentation background, you should look at what kind of instruments are currently being used by different spacecraft to look for, signatures of life. So you'll find that some of them are spectrometers. So and that does not require a background in biology. You just have to have a strong background in physics and in instrumentation. So again, it really depends what aspect of astrobiology you're tackling, and you don't need to have a biology background, but it definitely does not hurt for you to get it.
And we will take one last question now. It is, have you observed the mere existence of microorganisms or extremophiles in any other planet?
So far, we have not observed any certain confirmed evidence of microorganisms. The only thing closest that we have found right now on Mars is you have certain, and I think I don't have a slide on it, but I will look it up if people are interested, is there are certain old hot spring sites on Mars. So Mars, as we know, at some point of time had a warm and wet environment, and it had a thick enough atmosphere that was able to sustain liquid water on its surface. Liquids could sustain itself on its surface because the atmospheric pressure was high enough, and that allowed liquids to be present on the surface. And there were hot springs at one point of time. We've already seen some remnants of old hot springs on the surface of Mars, and they are actually very similar to some hot springs that we have here on Earth. There's one site in Chile in South America where we have these kind of similar hot springs, and we find some very strange looking minerals on the surface around the hot springs in Chile. And we know for a fact that they had been formed by bacterial activity. They're actually a biological product. And we have actually found very similar looking nodules or minerals on the surface of Mars. And that place is actually begging us to go back and investigate those particular nodules. Are they a byproduct of perhaps early life? So that is, I think, the only, you can say, evidence that we have found so far of something that could be a byproduct of life. But till date, we have not found any extremophile or any organism or even like a dead body of a organism so far on the surface of Mars or anywhere, in fact, in the solar system or outside.
Okay, so there are more questions, but let's continue and we will take those questions in the end.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So I'll keep moving. All right. So my slide is still, I hope, visible. Shivam, you can
Yes,
see
sir.
my slides?
It's visible. It's visible, sir. We can
Okay.
see your slide.
Sounds good. All right. So I'll just power through this. So this is basically our first experiment that we have built here at Amity. It's a small, if people remember, like old VHS type, those video cassettes that used to come. Some of you might be too young to even have seen them, but those of you who have, it's basically a small compact slot within which we have built a small observation unit. So the whole objective of this experiment is to observe the growth of two small plant samples in microgravity. So this actually will be fitted, if you see the right side of the screen, it is actually fitted on the ISRO PS4 platform. So ISRO PSLV, after the fourth stage, has put the main satellite, the primary satellite of ISRO, into orbit. The platform from which this particular final payload from ISRO is launched, that particular platform is called PS4. So PS4 is on which where these scientific experiments are being established. So this is a new kind of a concept which ISRO is now looking at, because ISRO launches a lot of PSLV rockets, and every year, whenever there used to be a PSLV rocket launch, the fourth stage was basically just burnt in the Earth's atmosphere and it was brought back. Whereas now what ISRO is planning is it's planning to continue to keep this platform for about 6 months to 1 year. And the idea there is to continue doing some experiments. So this is a new opportunity that ISRO has offered, and we were selected for this particular opportunity at Amity as part of the Exceed Space Share chassis, as you can see also on the right side. And we are one out of 10 student payloads that are fitted inside this particular chassis. And it's a non-recoverable payload, which means we don't get the experiment back. So whatever experiment we are flying, we have to take the observations while it is in space and send that data back to us. So we have an onboard camera that is taking these measurements. It is measuring the growth of two plant samples, and we are flying tobacco plant callus. So it's a high yield crop. So we want to observe how does a high yielding sample grow in space, and the application is that in the future it will support all forms of food that we can grow, within a short span of time in space. And right now it's more of a technology demonstration where we have tried to develop this particular payload, and that actually is now being discussed within ISRO for some other kinds of experiments as well. So we can modify it and we can do different kinds of plant biology or molecular biology, looking at all forms of animal cells or materials that we want to observe, and we can fly this again. So this is an experiment that we built in 3 months, and I was very proud of the team of students. We had people from biotechnology, we had mechanical, computer science, electrical students that worked with me on this particular project, and that's basically this project. And this is basically the whole launch cycle. Like I said, you have the rocket that launches from Sriharikota, and the fourth stage is basically where we have our experiment, located. And we are, you can say, the ISRO main satellite is like a passenger on this rocket, and we are co-passengers. So Exceed Space is a co-passenger, and we are within that another passenger. So this is a very common form of concept. It is called piggybacking. So you have like small experiments that are flown on larger missions. So we don't have to have our own independent launch for doing these things. Moving to something different, like I mentioned, the Mars analog work. So since 2016, we have been involved in studying some of the very astrobiology relevant sites in Ladakh. So this was a expedition that was held in 2016 as part of the NASA Spaceward Bound program. So I was the leader of that particular expedition, working closely with special experts in astrobiology from a geochemistry point or a geology point. And we were basically studying several sites around Ladakh. And I have some slides later to talk about that, explain what those sites were. Here, what you see are hot springs. So why are hot springs important from an astrobiology point of view? So as we know that life, for it to start, it needs some energy, a natural form of energy, right? So that energy will basically enable chemical reactions to take place. Now, where does this energy come from? Normally, it comes from within the earth, right? And hot springs are a very promising site where people are now trying to understand that perhaps the origin of life on Earth took place around these hot springs, terrestrial hot springs, so land hot springs. And what makes the hot springs in Ladakh interesting is it's at a very high altitude. Some of you might have visited Ladakh. It's at 3,500 to almost 6,000 meters above sea level. And at such high altitudes, the oxygen level is about 50% of what we have here on the surface, at 0 meters above like the actual sea level. And it's heavily exposed to ultraviolet radiation. And Ladakh is very similar to early Mars. So way back, billions of years ago, in the Hesperian age of Mars, the planet was actually very similar to what Ladakh is right now. It actually had the similar amount of ultraviolet exposure and atmospheric pressure. So Ladakh right now has these sites where you see these microbial communities that are growing around these hot springs. And these hot springs are, normally like if you go to a surface, you have to dig to see what is underneath. Whereas a hot spring, what it does is it is throwing out things from inside. So it's actually doing half the work for you. It's bringing out all the life, all the chemistry of rocks and minerals, how they're interacting with the fluids inside, and giving you all your evidence to you. So these are perfect sites, ideal sites for studying some of the initial environments in which life might have started. And one of the papers that came out from this study, I've listed it there. It was published last year in the International Journal of Astrobiology. And like you can see on the bottom of the screen, this was a international interdisciplinary effort. So there were teams involved from NASA Ames, JPL. We had people from Australia, Mars Society Australia, as well as we actually tested a European Mars rover as well, the ExoMars 2020's one of the instruments was tested on this particular expedition. So another thing that we are doing right now is we are actually planning to establish a research station in Ladakh. So this station will enable students to conduct experiments from an astrobiology perspective, or also a Mars habitability perspective for humans to live on the surface of Mars. And one of the similar facilities exists already in China. And we've been working in this region for the last 4 years now. And we want to have some kind of a semi-permanent presence. So it will give an opportunity for students to do these kind of activities in India itself, rather than having to go to other similar stations that exist in the US or other parts of the world, like in Australia. So the Mars Amity station would be a station that would enable students in India to do Mars exploration and other astrobiology kind of projects. And right now, I have members from NASA as well as Mars Society Australia who are part of our team as adjunct faculty members. And it's a growing team. And hopefully, we'll have more researchers who are part of the Astrobiology Center. Another very interesting site that we visited is Lonar Crater, which is actually a crater site near Aurangabad in Maharashtra. And this crater is formed in basaltic rock. Basalt is a very hard form of rock. And anything that is formed in that, is preserved for hundreds and thousands or even millions of years. And if you look at other planets or even our moon, you will find a lot of craters, right? Whereas on Earth, there are not as many craters. So one of the reasons why that is because Earth is having a environment, it's having a weathering processes like rain, there's wind, there's snow, plus all kinds of precipitation, rivers, and slowly and steadily over a point of time, all of these craters fill up, right? Whereas on other planets, we don't have these kind of weathering processes. So all of the craters are well preserved. And basalt is actually very common in the solar system. Many planets are having basaltic rock and craters that are formed in basaltic rock, including Mars. But on Earth, there are only 4 craters that are still, you can say, preserved. Many of the other craters that perhaps were formed over the last billions of years of Earth's history have actually got filled up because of the weathering processes. And we are very lucky in India to have one such crater which is easily accessible for doing science. Now, you will be asking, why are we studying craters? What is the importance from an astrobiology perspective? The importance is that the 2020 rover mission from NASA, it's now called, I think, Perseverance, that rover is actually landing inside a crater on Mars called Jezero crater. And for us, we are landing inside a crater because we want to understand how, and especially this crater is having a delta. A delta is basically formed whenever you're having a water body or a stream that is slowly flowing inside a kind of a small, you can say a low-lying region. So you have a delta that forms there. So instead of the rover having to travel, tens of kilometers, hundreds of kilometers on the surface of Mars, it can go to a delta, you can say inflow point inside a crater, because you will have the sediment by sediment deposition of organics that have been transported by the water body over, hundreds and thousands of millions of years. And there is no weathering process right now on Mars. So it is currently, you can see, a place where perhaps the evidence of the deposition of organics is there, ready for us to be explored. So that is why NASA has chosen this particular crater, and specifically near this delta region, to study the deposition and perhaps finding some proof of any form of biological signatures that might have gotten deposited because of this delta. And in Lonar, luckily we have a similar delta formation. As you can see in the image, you see a green patch towards the further end of the crater. And that is a delta formation where the small stream is basically bringing in deposition and is collecting inside in the form of a lake. So there are several aspects of this crater that can help us train our astronauts or develop some of our instruments and also scientific experiments for Mars. That is why this particular crater becomes important. Another site is in Kutch, Rann of Kutch. Many of you know it's a great. Rann of Kutch is one of the largest salt expanses of the world. And if life would have existed on the Mars surface, it would have existed inside water bodies in very salty conditions. So you have, just like the image that I had taken a year back on the top left, of a very salty pond where you can see the reddish color because of the bacteria that survives in this salty environment. Salt kills organisms. That is why, you know, you must have seen in the olden times when people used to carry any meat on ships, they used to put a lot of salt on it. Even right now, when you prepare any pickles, you put a lot of salt in it because salt breaks down the cell walls and it basically kills life. But you have life right now on Earth that actually has evolved over thousands of years, hundreds and thousands of years, and is surviving in these salty conditions. It is not just surviving, it is flourishing, it is living very well. So it is very important for astrobiology people to understand these extreme environments within which such life is living. And we have certain kinds of these ponds in Kutch region of Gujarat here in India. So these are some of the sites in Ladakh, like I mentioned. And Ladakh is very interesting because it is having some very diverse set of sites. You're having hot springs, you're having saline lakes, you're having permanently covered ice and permafrost, which is permanently covered ice, like I mentioned. And you're also having some dunes, sand dunes, and small ponds within them. And these are very similar features to what we find on Mars as well. So Ladakh is very special because it is having such different kind of, you know, Mars-like regions in very close proximity. Like within 100 kilometers, you're having these very diverse, distinct forms of environments, and it's very important for scientists to understand that how is life living in these very different environments so close to each other, and the life is actually very different from each other as well. And Lonar Crater, like I have already mentioned, and Kutch, like I've already mentioned. Another important analog is in Antarctica. So many of you would also be knowing that India actually has two stations in Antarctica. One is in Larsman Hills called the Bharti station. It is the newer one. And there are certain portions of it which are not covered by ice. It's actually ice free. So many of you might be thinking of Antarctica as being completely covered in ice, but there are actually some regions which are ice free that don't have an ice deposition on them. And why is that? Well, because there is a lot of radiothermal heating that is coming from within. So there are some naturally occurring radioactive minerals that are present inside the subsurface, within the subsurface of these regions. And the heat that is coming from it ensures that the soil doesn't freeze and there is no ice cover on it. So this actually allows us for conducting some very important studies where we look at the geological formation, the evolution of how the rocks have evolved there and compare them to Mars. And the reason why we have chosen those rocks is because they have evolved in such similar, very cold, dry conditions like we have seen on the surface of Mars. So that's why we have these Mars analogs within the Indian, in close proximity to Indian terrain as well. And other sites are actually caves. So you have limestone caves in Meghalaya, some of the longest caves, in fact, that we have in Meghalaya, and Uttarakhand, Chhattisgarh, and some lava caves as well. And people have been studying the subsurface. So it is important to understand that if life exists or had existed on the surface of Mars, it perhaps would have been in a very hostile environment because Mars does not have a magnetic field right now. So a lot of the radiation that is coming in is actually impacting directly on the surface and it perhaps killed out most of the life. The presence of toxic materials on the surface like perchlorates is also not good, and there's obviously very large temperature radiate from day to night. So if you go under the surface of Mars, you will find that most of this radiation gets blocked. You find that the temperature is relatively very well stabilized, and these are perfect places where perhaps life still exists or might have existed in the past. And water, in fact, can also be found in a liquid temperature there. Perhaps, we don't know yet, but perhaps there's a chance that there is subsurface liquid water on Mars. So to study how life on Earth has evolved inside caves is very important. So similar studies have been identified for caves within in India. Many of you might not know this, but India actually has within its territory a volcano on Barren Island in the Andaman Sea. It's an active volcano site. And again, volcanoes, just like hot springs, are a source of energy, which might have led to some of the initial chemical reactions. They're called prebiotic reactions before life had started. That might have led to the origin of life. It's one of the studies that is. And another aspect is also studying how in these volcanic environments, these hot, very acidic environments, how today we are finding very complex bacteria, similar to that has been found in the barren island. And another very exciting place is actually inside the oceans. So some of you might have heard of hydrothermal vents. So just like we have hot springs on the surface of our planet, we actually have these kind of similar vents inside the oceans, on the surface, on the bottom of the oceans. They're called hydrothermal vents. So we have these hot gases that are coming out, fluids that are coming out from the Earth's inner mantle. You're finding that these kind of places are actually harboring a lot of both simple as well as complex life. People have actually found shrimps and crabs that actually have evolved inside the oceans. They have never come close to the Earth's surface of the ocean. They've actually evolved, and till date they're only present there. So that tells us that perhaps on icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn, which are far away from the sun, so they are not getting enough heat from the sun, but inside them they have confirmed presence of these liquid water bodies, and they might actually be having these hydrothermal vents as well, and they might in fact be completely independent of what is existing on the surface. So there's potential for finding life there as well. So it's another very exciting opportunity where we are finding these kind of hydrothermal vents, and one vent field actually exists in the southern Indian Ocean that so far has not been studied from an astrobiology point of view. So perhaps in the future, some of you would be interested in building a vehicle that can actually travel to those depths, a remotely operated vehicle, submersible, that can go and explore and look at how life is evolving there, as is being done by other astrobiologists in other parts of the world. So another thing that I've been doing is mentoring of students. So like I mentioned, the space biology experiment, I was involved in building this space flight experiment. And I've also been working with a team of students in Amity, Noida, and they have actually been part of building some radiation shielding for the habitats for Mars. So on a personal capacity, I have actually mentored some students, and there are other opportunities within the Blue Marble Space Organization, and I'll talk about those as well as the questions come along. And another thing that we've been doing is we've been uniting the astrobiologists in India. So we're actually now in the process of formalizing a society. We are calling it the Society for Astrobiology Education and Research, SABER. So the SABER community basically will be a group of astrobiologists. So astrobiology as a field right now exists in the form of these relevant subjects, like you have prebiotic chemistry, you have geology, early geology, so pre-Cambrian age geology, and you have different aspects of planetary sciences, chemistry. So the idea is to unite everybody who's interested in astrobiology within the society, and this will actually enable scientists to work together. And right now we're also now talking with ISRO for designing more missions for astrobiology, and it will also enable students such as some of you to undertake summer internships projects for astrobiology. I will not take more time because I think we should leave some time for questions. So recently we did a workshop here in Mumbai. This was the last week of February, so just I think a few weeks before the COVID virus affected our lives. We actually did this 3-day introductory workshop for science and engineering students. We had about 30 students who were selected, who came from 9 cities across India from different backgrounds. And some of the adjunct faculty members who I mentioned, they were present. So they actually led some of the discussions on the introduction to astrobiology. And we actually did some hands-on activities like observing some rock samples on Earth that actually gave us a lot of clues for looking for life on Mars. And we did some drawing activities. How do you look at rocks, observe them, and what are the features that are important? And some discussions. That was good. And right after that workshop, we actually ran a workshop for the general public. So this was a more general space for everyone workshop that actually involved some of the concepts of astrobiology. And we had an interactive session with a NASA astronaut, as you can see in the bottom center image, Steve Smith. Thanks to Blue Marble Space, we were able to connect with him and observe rocks, look at small simple forms of life through microscopes. And we actually also ran a VR challenge. So we are working with a company in Pune for developing a Mars virtual reality experience that is being developed for both education outreach as well as for training students and scientists for doing field work. So the idea there was that you wear the headset. Some of you might have experienced virtual reality. So you wear the headset and you have these hand tools that you can use to pick up and drop flags. And within, I think, 7 minutes, they had to identify some features so they could roam around that entire room. And inside their world, they are on the surface of Mars. That was, completely built from scratch. So we actually built a Mars virtual reality environment. And one person was the simulation astronaut. So he had been given 7 minutes. And on the top right, you see some members who were sitting outside. They were simulating the mission control. So they were given a small two-dimensional map of the entire section, and the person inside was being guided by them. And he had to find certain features on the surface of Mars that would help us understand the prospect of finding life, such as ice or mud volcanoes or these small blue hematite iron balls that are called blueberries. And then they had a discussion to answer some questions about what are the most important features of science or resources and which is the biggest safety hazard. So I think it was a very fun, interactive, hands-on experience that everybody enjoyed. And we are actually now developing this to start this as a course at Amity that will be offered hopefully by the later half of this year. Given how the situation is, we are trying to evolve how do we go about it. So I think before that, I'll mention that we were actually planning a field expedition to Ladakh in August, but obviously now with the current situation, it seems highly unlikely that will happen. But what we will do is we will have an online expedition where we will be having some instructors who will be joining us from the organizations who have collaborated with us from NASA, Mars Society Australia, or other places. And through Google Earth and some of the videos that we captured and 360 images that we captured, we will have online participants kind of having a virtual reality feel of what does it feel like to do astrobiology research. It's not just a picnic where everybody is just going out. You actually get to learn things, look at the features, answer some questions. So that is all being currently designed and planned, and hopefully we will be able to announce it towards the end of this month and have it maybe sometime next month. So all of you can stay in touch for that. On a personal level, I'm also started a YouTube channel called Space for All. So I should be putting out more content on it as we go along. And that's my last slide. I'm very happy to take questions.
Okay, sir, thank you very much for this great session on astrobiology and planetary sciences. So let's move on to some questions that we have got from the audience. So one of the question is, what is the probability that the microorganisms transmitted via humans to a planet while stepping foot on it can thrive and evolve in that planet?
So that's a good question. Basically, that's called forward contamination, where you as an astronaut are going to a planet and you cannot 100% sterilize yourself. You will always have some bugs on you, some bacteria on you, and there are chances, yes, as much as you might try to sanitize yourself, that you will be leaving some of your imprints on the other planet. And so they haven't done a study where you can see how long they survive. They might survive for a while, but what we have seen so far is the probability of it actually multiplying and kind of creating small, doing a colonization, a bacterial colonization, that has not taken place yet. And we know that because some of the initial spacecraft that were actually sent were not sterilized. So the chances are low, but we still don't want that because we're still looking for life, and you want to ensure that you minimize the amount of life you are bringing with you. Because when you find something, you're not sure then that that life that you're looking at is something that you brought from Earth, or is it something that already exists there.
Okay, sir. And let's wait. I'll just inform the audience that they can ask questions now. Okay, so there's one more question for you. Have you cooperated with planetary protection specialists in NASA and other organizations?
So yeah, so good question. We actually have, and one of our colleagues at NASA JPL, his name is Dr. Parag Vaishampayan, and he is a planetary protection scientist. So he has worked closely with us, and he is in fact involved in I think all the ongoing missions right now of Mars, including the Mars 2020 rover, which will be launching in the next few months, as well as the Mars InSight lander, which landed on the surface of Mars recently. And yes, we have been involved. And in fact, it becomes very interesting because when you're trying to collect samples, even in Ladakh, you want to ensure that you do it within planetary protection protocols. So we actually follow some very strict guidelines to ensure that we don't contaminate some of the samples that we're picking up. So it's actually a huge problem even if people are involved, let alone if you're trying to do it on a planet where it's just robotics, it's all automated. You want to ensure that your samples are not contaminated, forward or backward contaminated.
Uh, Great answer, sir. And it's really interesting, this field of astrobiology, and there are more questions based on it. So there is one question. What do you think is the possibility of finding extraterrestrial life forms that are not carbon-based? Any insights on this? Like non-carbon-based life forms is what they're asking about.
Yeah. So the only other element that could be, based on our current understanding of the periodic table, silicon is the next ideal base that could perhaps form similar complex molecules that could eventually, potentially, based on the amount of energy it needs, form life, artificial or silicon-based life, as people call it. The problem with silicon is that it actually requires a lot more activation energy than carbon. And Titan is one planet where people actually say that perhaps there are chances that we could find life that is silicon based. Currently, we don't have a complete understanding of how that mechanism would take place. So theoretically speaking, yes, it is very much possible. It's as active as carbon is in that sense. But the reason why it hasn't taken off on Earth or in any other similar environment is because we haven't got a complete understanding of how it will happen, which is why it's important to understand that we only have one model of life that we know, that is our own model, which is carbon based. Anything else is something theoretically, yes, it is being considered, but we don't think that we have a complete understanding of how that will take place.
Okay, and there's one more question by Gaurav. It's which analog serves to be best for study, whether it's a deep sea hydrothermal vents or terrestrial hot springs?
Well, it's actually two different, you can say, schools of thought. Like a lot of people, it's very disputed within the astrobiology community. Many people feel that the presence of water, a constant presence of water would actually prevent the origin of life to take place. You will always require an exposure to atmosphere. So it depends who you really ask. So scientifically speaking, there's strong points that come from both the camps, whether that is a terrestrial hot spring, which quote unquote would mean perhaps like, for example, Mars, or a hydrothermal origin of life, which quote unquote could be, for example, Europa or Enceladus, the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. So there's evidences that go towards each other and against each other. The other thing to understand is if you're trying to see which is easier to study, obviously terrestrial hot springs, because getting to hydrothermal vents requires so much more logistics, so much more technical capabilities as compared to visiting the terrestrial hot springs as we have here close to us, in Ladakh or other similar places.
Thanks for getting this question, sir. There's one more interesting question coming out. Sir, please tell me about something on tardigrades, water beer. What is your opinion on this? Because it is big research. Okay, so he wants your opinion on tardigrades.
So tardigrades, as we know them, are small organisms. They're called, I think, micro animals, and they have shown the ability to live in very extreme conditions. In fact, they've actually flown some small tardigrades to space as well, and they've actually survived the temperatures as well as the amount of radiation that they were exposed to, and deprivation to oxygen and all those kind of things. they're not called extremophiles because what they do is they kind of go into a state of hibernation. They actually shut themselves off. They don't really survive in the sense that they don't conduct anything in that environment, which is what extremophiles actually do. Extremophiles have evolved to a point where they don't shut themselves off. They continue their metabolism or their regular biological activities in those environments, whereas tardigrades actually shut themselves off. So they are, I think, an excellent example to see how organisms could evolve to isolate themselves from the extremes of life, but not so much to see how do they evolve within the harsh conditions of the extremes of life.
I hope he has got his answer. And let me see if there are more interesting questions available now. Uh, One is it possible to build a tricorder that can detect life on other planets using a portable system? If so, how would you do it? Laser spectroscopy or lab on a chip?
Great question. So absolutely, I think that's a Star Trek fan who's asking this question. So a tricorder is something like a small remote that was used in the Star Trek universe to check whether a planet had what kind of elements it had, and whether it is having enough abilities. I mean, in real world scenario, we are working towards something that would be a tricorder, something that could perhaps fit in a palm of our hand, like a cell phone, that you can point, to a particular object or an atmosphere or an environment, and it can straight away tell us the concentration of the atmosphere, tell us the geology, all of those kind of things. To answer specifically the question whether it would be spectroscopy or lab on a chip, I think lab on a chip perhaps might be closer because we do have small, compact machines that can actually tell us a lot more about what we're looking at, whether it is biological or whether there is some kind of an activity which might be biological or abiological. That is actually difficult to tell. So things like small sequencing, RNA, DNA sequencing, those kind of things, yes, it can be done. And it might come closest, but it wouldn't be a tricorder, because a tricorder is something which tells you a lot more than that. It tells you about the environment, and that's where a spectrometer would come in. But we don't have something which is small enough. So it's a good question actually, whether to what would actually classify more as a tricorder, whether it be a spectrometer or a lab on a chip. I guess it might need to have components of both those things, because you actually need to have a complete understanding. You do need to know the spectroscopic signatures of what you're looking at, so that you're able to tell the minerals that actually exist in those environments. And you also need to tell whether what you're looking at is biological activity or not, which spectrometers by itself will tell or not. So to the answer the question, I think a hybrid of having both a lab on a chip and some kind of a wide range spectrometer would be needed to build a tricorder.
Great, great. So, as we are running out of time, we'll just take two or three questions more. So, one question is, sir, is Olivine or Olivine? I don't know what's the pronunciation. Sir, is Olivine responsible for origin of life?
So that's again a very you can say still not completely understood subject. So we have actually seen some kind of bacteria that lives inside olivine. So olivine is a kind of a mineral. It's a green colored mineral that has been found on Mars as well. And it's still not been completely well understood. But whether that is required, from an origin of life point of view, we still do not know. It's actually one of the more interesting minerals that is being studied, and especially from a Mars perspective. As of now, we have a very fundamental or an elemental understanding of the origins of life. It hasn't reached a point where minerals perhaps could be direct indicators of biological activity or the origins of life, kind of a signal, whether whatever, if we find a particular mineral, whether that tells us this or not. But from an elemental point of view, yes, you mainly have carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, SNOPs as it is called. From an elemental point of view, yes, we do have these elements, key elements that tell us whether life exists or not. But even though we have found specific minerals where we have seen how life is actually living, and it could be, one of them could be jarosite, it could be olivine, it's hard to kind of, at this point of time, with our limited understanding, say that there could be indicators of the origins of life.
Okay. And there is one more question related to Viking probes. So it goes like this: do we still use anything similar to the wolf trap that was fitted on the Viking probes? So I think
I'm
he's
not,
asking about that chemical.
yeah, I'm not completely familiar with the wolf trap, but as far as we understand, the results from the Viking were ambiguous. The way the mission was designed was not completely answering, or rather, posing the right questions, scientific questions. So there were some results, and because if you don't pose your questions, in the right way, the answers that you get will not help you, which is what the problem was at the end of the day. And that's why today it's very hard to pose the right questions, because we still do not understand completely what is biotic and what is, well, we have a good understanding of what is biotic and abiotic, but to say that we have a complete understanding of something which is living or non-living, or perhaps which was living in the past and is not living, we don't. And to give you an example, even to date, when you look at some rocks, some of the earliest rocks in the solar system, on Earth, and people sometimes publish that yes, what we are looking at, some kind of small lines, layer depositions, that is actually caused because of a bacteria that lived at that point of time. There's always a group of people who contest that and say that no, that is not a biological byproduct, it was actually a geochemical byproduct. So even on Earth, we don't have a kind of a consensus on some of the evidences that we see in these early rocks, whether that's life or not. And this understanding actually only came in the last few decades. So this is way after the Viking missions. And that time, I think people did not completely appreciate the complexity of the problem. And that is why now you have to fly a whole suite of instruments to be able to understand whether what you're looking at is, when you're trying to make a hypothesis, they try to probe it from different sides. So you normally have instruments like the Raman spectrometer, you have laser-induced breakdown spectrometer, LIBS. You also conduct XRD, so X-ray analysis using XRF or XRD. You also do thermal energy spectrums, infrared, visual. So you have all of these different kind of optical as well as spectroscopic analysis, and you have to kind of take the readings from all of these different instruments and then try to come to a conclusion. But even then, there's a lot of complexities. So it's actually a problem that has not been cracked. So posing the right scientific questions to look for life is something which is still not completely well understood. And people try to do what has been done in the past, where you have understood how life exists, for example, at a terrestrial hot spring here on Earth, and then based on that, you try to build a system. And I think that is one of the only ways you can go about doing this.
Okay, so and sir, this is a one very interesting question. Questions put by one of my teammate. So he is asking, what kind of biological adjustments are needed in a life form to exist in a planet that is close to a black hole? Okay.
Okay, so interesting question. If you're close to a black hole, what would happen? How would that physically affect your planet? Gravity would definitely get affected, I'm assuming. You would, again, this is outside my field, so I'm trying to answer this question. You would perhaps be having a lot of physical forces, because if you're close to a black hole, again, depends on how close you are, because if you're too close, you'll probably get sucked in, right? But assuming you're at a fair enough distance that you can that the planet would survive for at least 1,000 years or hundreds of thousands of years for life to have evolved. And then how is it affected, right? That's your question. So firstly, gravity. I think that might be something that would be extremely perhaps even varied, or if it would not be varied, it would be very high for that matter. So gravitational forces would be high, and other physical forces, if it's a body that has water on it or other forms of liquid on it, tidal forces would be very strong. So you would perhaps, if you are a microorganism living, in a small tide pool on a beach on the planet, you are constantly being, exposed to thunderous tidal waves that are coming in and hitting you. So I'm guessing the cell walls at some point would need to evolve in a way that they are rigid enough to withstand some of those physical forces that it's being affected by. I'm not sure. There might be other similar aspects. I don't think we have enough understanding of how planets are close to black holes. So I think these are some of the basic things that come to my mind. But good question.
Okay, sir. So we'll take one last question, and it is about biomarkers. So, what they are asking is, can lipids be, considered as a biomarker to detect the extraterrestrial life?
So good question. Lipids are fats, right? So they have actually been shown to preserve organics very well. So whenever you're trying to find life, you will have to find it in some form of a preserved mode. And you look at what kind of minerals, what kind of organic compounds are preserving these organics. And lipids happens to be a very well preserving, chemical product. And even in Ladakh, we actually found the amount of biological preservation in the clays close to some of the dunes was actually way more than some of the other forms of life that was preserved in just regular grains of dust or sand. And that has been well proven. Lipids have been proven to preserve organics very well. So that's true. We will actually be looking for clays, and within clays, we'll be looking at how you have these kind of fatty lipids that would perhaps be storing life, or proof of life at least.
So thank you, sir. We end this session here. So I hope all the audience, they got a good insight on astrobiology and planetary sciences from our expert. And I hope this so-called, this field is actually very not well known among young students and everything. So I hope people who have joined this webinar today, they will go and tell their friends about this field. And I hope more even non-bio students will try pursuing it, get inspired from Siddharth sir. And for any queries and concerns, you all can contact us. Take care. On our website, we have a forum section. If you go and type spaceonova.com/forum, you can write your questions there, and we will try getting connected with experts to answer your questions. I hope you all have enjoyed this session, and we will end this session here. And there will be more webinars coming.
Yeah. Shivam, before you end the session, I think I'll also answer a question that some of the people might have in their minds and might have not asked, is opportunities wise. So right now, within Amity University, there will be opportunities for doing summer internships. We'll actually be announcing them on our website. So I'll be sharing it with Spaceonova, and then you guys can pass it on to all your page followers. And there will be opportunities at Amity University, Mumbai, to engage in astrobiology projects from this summer itself onwards. So I'll be sharing that soon. The other thing is, I would like to urge all the people to be very, very careful with some of other organizations in India that are conducting astrobiology courses. And one of the organizations is actually called Indian Astrobiology Research Center. So before you enroll for it and pay for the course, make sure you go through the course curriculum. And one of the reasons why we as astrobiologists highlight these institutions is because sometimes they talk about conspiracy theories, pseudosciences like aliens and aliens contacting humans, and there's a lot of unscientific content in these programs, and we have to be very careful. When you're paying for some kind of a course, you want to ensure that the information you're getting is accurate. And some organizations, unfortunately, do not distinguish between what is scientific and unscientific, right? So I would say to all students to make sure that you go through the course curriculum and find all the information of what is there and what is not there. And if you're finding any form of pseudoscience or conspiracy theories, I would suggest refrain from signing up from these courses and going to legitimate organizations, scientists, and working under them. So I really wish all the very best to all students. I hope they're excited and find some passion in whatever they like to do. And thanks again, Shivam, for giving this opportunity. We are way over time, but all the very best to everyone.
Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you very much. We will surely, some people are asking, are we going to have more sessions on this? So surely I will talk to sir. If, we get more time, we will bring some advanced webinar. As this was a basic one considering overview, we will bring some advanced webinars also, in which we can also give you certificate of completion maybe. So we will talk to sir. We will surely talk to sir about it. And thank you everybody for joining us today. I hope you had a fruitful session today, and thank you very much. So you all can sign off now. Best of luck.
Awesome. All right. Thanks a lot, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.